So let's pick up from the late Renaissance. So Renaissance architecture created a, in architecture, a new style that brought back the classical past. Which works okay, in the 15th century and the 16th century. The Pope was okay for the construction of a centralized plan in the St. Peter's Cathedral. But the Reformation changed all that direction. Reformation initiated in the early 16th century by Martin Luther, who criticized the luxurious lifestyle of the church. He especially criticized the power and efficacy of indulgence. In order to finance the reconstruction of St. Peter's, popes start selling indulgence for people to buy their way into heaven. So they claim if you contribute money, you buy these indulgence and you have the ticket to heaven. And Martin Luther criticized that. He posted his criticism in the city, saying, "Why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest, Croesus was, the richest person in the Roman Empire. He built the Basilica of St. Peter's with the money of poor believers rather than with his own money." So here on the left, we have the print showing the unfinished St. Peter's still going on in 1537. And Martin Luther criticized that construction of monumental architecture in the name of God, but using the monies of the poor. And the popes were living in huge palaces, enjoying beautiful Renaissance garden, and constructing the largest building in the world. So Reformation started, and Martin Luther made the point that everyone had the ability and had the right to interpret Bible by themselves. There was no need for the church to serve as the intermediate between God and the believer. So that is the spirit of all those Reformed Christianity. There were Lutheran, there were Calvinism, there were Presbyterian, etc. So all these Anglican, so all these new movement, they formed the Reformed Christianity. The central claim is to avoid going through Vatican, to avoid going through those very institutionalized, bureaucratic church system. Instead of relying on the church to interpret the Bible, so the new Reformed Christianity believe everyone can just get the message from God by reading Bible themselves. So that, of course, hurt the authority of the church, hurt the authority of Vatican and Pope, bishop the organized the Reformation. The fight back. Counter-Reformation tried to reinstall the authority of the church centered with Vatican, and they eventually became known as Catholic, right? Catholic. Before Martin Luther, there was no difference between Catholic or something else. There's no others. So after the Reformation, there's the Reformed Christianity, and there's the Catholic, which is centered with Vatican. So it is the Catholic after Reformation who start to re-emphasize some of the medieval value in church building. For example, they insisted on a Latin cross instead of the Renaissance centralized. And that was also the background for the extension of the St. Peter's into a Latin cross shape, and thus kind of making the original design by Michelangelo that kind of compromised that centralized plan. And the organization for the Counter-Reformation movement was the Jesuit. There are others as well, but Jesuit was one of the major force for the Counter-Reformation. In 1534, Ignatius of Loyola founded the Society of Jesus. And so the Jesuit, so these priests from the Society of Jesus became known as Jesuit. So Jesuit, they emphasized missionary. So they went to different part of the world to spread, to re-emphasize the authority of the Vatican and the Catholic. And they also spread the architectural style that eventually became known as Baroque, which is quite different from the Renaissance centralized plan. So the Baroque architecture focus on the Latin cross shape again. But after the Renaissance, they also incorporated a lot of the classical architectural vocabulary as well. So that is the religious background of Baroque, which is the religious force behind it is the Jesuit. The Jesuit highlighting missionary, so they went to different part of the world. They went to China. The kind of a Jesuit priests, they dressed in the Chinese robe, converted those a lot of Chinese scholars into the Society of Jesus. And early Christian architecture built in the Ming Dynasty were in the Baroque style, right? And so are in the New World. So Jesuit also came to the Americas, and a lot of those churches built in cities like Cusco, like Mexico City, they were constructed in the new Baroque fashion. So Baroque architecture was very influential because of the Counter-Reformation effort organized by the Pope, kind of facilitated by the Society of Jesus, that helped to popularize an architectural style, eventually became known as Baroque. So this is the first temple, the first church for the Society of Jesus, the Iogetsu, the Jesus Church of the Society of the Jesus. It was designed by Giacomo da Vignola. Vignola designed it in an unmistakable Latin cross shape. So here, in the late 16th century, Latin cross came back. And we have already seen that phenomena in some of the design by Palladio, right? So we know Palladio was already combining Latin cross shape with a centralized dome. So is the Baroque. So Baroque also, create those Latin cross interior. And here, there is a clear division between the nave and the aisle. So some of the medieval spatial element came back, but the central dome was still there and mark the crossing. So here we have a design by Palladio that remind you, Palladio practicing, even though his architecture was not considered Baroque. Baroque was not popular in the late 16th century at all. So this is the first church for the Society of Jesus. But Baroque as a movement, as an architectural style, was not formed there. But later, all those Jesuit church kind of look back to this building for inspiration, and eventually a new style was formed and it became popularized in the 17th century. Right? So let's take a look at the facade of this Iogetsu. So this is the facade. Compared to the Renaissance, there's a lot of similarity. For example, although the interior space remind us those medieval church basilica, Latin cross, the facade looks very classical. It has a classical temple front with pediment, classical orders, and the center is elevated to cover the taller nave, and then the side roofs are lower. We can tell that. So the side is lower. That is for the space of the aisle. So the interior space is reflected quite clearly on the facade, the tall center and the low side. However, it's primarily using classical vocabulary. But if we compare it with a Renaissance building built 100 years earlier by Alberti. So this is Alberti's design of the San Maria Novella. There are a lot of similarity. Pediment, columns, orders, but there is also a significant difference. And these difference would become the characteristic features for the 17th century Baroque architecture. One difference is, in Alberti's design, the columns on the upper floor and the lower floor are not lined up. So for example, here, the columns are here, supporting that pediment. But on the first floor, the columns are located at totally different locations. Here, 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 and there. They are not connected. But in Iogetsu, the first floor and the second floor, they lined up, right? So they lined up. As a result, Iogetsu facade has a greater vertical axis because now you can connect those columns. Actually, there are pilasters and form a visual continuity, a vertical visual continuity. And that vertical continuity is a characteristic of Gothic in medieval architecture. Renaissance architecture in general highlight those horizontality and centralized plan as reflected in Alberti's facade. So there, the horizontal line is unbroken. Thus, that horizontality was emphasized, and the upper floor and the first floor are clearly divided. So that highlight of verticality is the first characteristic of Baroque architecture, whose seed was already buried in the Iogatsu. Iogatsu learned from Alberti using that kind of a curve to make transition between the central nave and the side aisle, same as what Alberti did 100 years ago, right? Same as what Alberti did 100 years ago. But there are some kind of a manipulation of classical form. While in Alberti, those classical form are existed in clear cut form without any ambiguity, right? So we have those, pediment, we have the entablature columns. So the lower part looks almost like a trifle arch, a Roman trifle arch, with division of bays and a central bay, etc. So all those are classical form, geometric arches, etc. But in Iogatsu, by Vignola, there are some manipulation of classical form. For example, here we have the double column. And double column is unnecessary in classical order. But we do know Michelangelo was already using double column. And we consider Michelangelo as the initiator of the Mannerist movement. So there are some redundancy in the using of classical form and the manipulation of classical form. Similarly, we have this kind of a redundant gable. There is a triangular gable. There is also a arched gable. And that kind of overlapping gable is totally unnecessary structurally. And it is pure decoration here. And it is a manipulation of classical form. So let's compare Iogatsu with its contemporary Palladio. We find, again, in Palladio, there is a greater attachment to authentic classical form. Classical elements were used more in its authentic fashion, even though here we have those overlap of these temples. But you can imagine, here we have a central temple front, and the lower part can be imagined as a second temple front hidden behind the central taller one. So each of them are self-sufficient and using unmistakable classical form. But Iogatsu start to deconstruct those classical form and creating a new blending, a new mixture, and a new manipulation of classical form for a new architectural image. And that new architectural image is closer to pre-Renaissance medieval spirit, in its highlighting of those verticality and disbanding those horizontality. So, and we can also compare it with a late work by Michelangelo, This is the building designed by Michelangelo, and that manipulation of classical form that eventually became a characteristic in mannerism represented by Romano can also be observed in Baroque. So Baroque kind of inherited all those previous development in European architecture, Renaissance, mannerism, kind of a late Renaissance in terms of the incorporation of Latin cross in its spatial division, and articulated it into a facade that is kind of returning back to the kind of Gothic in spirit, in its emphasis on the kind of a vertical rising. Here, there's no spire, no tower, but still on the facade, it created that kind of sense of rising up instead of the horizontal calmness in typical Renaissance architecture. So that verticality was not only emphasized on the facade, but also in the interior. And in the interior, the central crossing with light shedding down created that kind of drawing upward movement. And in the nave, the ceiling was painted with bright color, and that also draw one's attention to the ceiling. So in the interior, there is also an emphasis of rising up, vertical ascension. But this is an early example, so we call this Baroque yet. So it still is somewhere in between late Renaissance and the beginning of Baroque, but all those characteristics is going to become typical Baroque features. So, I'm going to, I notice we are 10 minutes past our time, so I'm going to stop here and we will pick up on Friday. Thank you very much for your patience.